And yes, Tampa Bay was embarrassed after that. But and we talk about message sending and what that would mean in 2022 compared to maybe the late 90s when we did it. But it hasn't changed all that much. All I got out of the last few minutes of that hockey game is Tampa Bay's telling the Leafs and the rest of the world, we're not going away quietly here. We're just getting started.
That's exactly what it is. And again, the impact of a fight. Listen, I mean, there was a couple stitches maybe in Tampa's locker room after that game, but really, I don't even know if the energy transfers over to game 2. But one thing I can tell you is there will be players that will either be, understimulated or overstimulated and might take a penalty early in the game, like Clifford did, because they're overstimulated because of what transpired or happened at the end of the game. So it's a matter of coaching right now, and your leaders in the locker room, your veteran players. Tampa's got a lot of them to, inspire their teammates, but also get them to that perfect level of performance. And that's the hardest thing, to get 20 players, in that zone at the same time. That's why, in the game of hockey, it's, teams go on streaks, winning. Sometimes they lose, but it's because they don't have that same energy or that same level of commitment, throughout your lineup.
What did you make of the officiating? Very different from how we tend to think of playoff hockey, right? The old nothing gets called, put the whistles away. 10 penalties last night. Did you think it was excessive?
No, I don't think so. I mean, when I was watching now, could there be fewer penalties? Probably. But at the end of the day, you got two great offensive teams in this series, and penalties are going to hurt. The team that takes the most penalties, unless they, have incredible, 7, 10, 12-day, periods for their penalty killers, whoever takes the most penalties is going to lose this series, I believe.
As far as Cooper and Tampa here, you got a veteran team. Does he go into last night or this morning trying to figure out how hard you're going to push a veteran team or challenge them this early? Or do you expect them to more or less figure it out on their own? Because we are talking about guys that have been around the block a few times.
Well, I bet you, probably some of John Cooper's, his greatest attributes as a coach is understanding when to push and when not to. Mm-hmm. And he's got a team of champions, Stanley Cup winners in that locker room, just getting started, to try to win their third in a row. And, I'm sure they were, focused and ready to go, but, there's going to be a moment, I'm sure, if they get down this series by another game or two, maybe that speech changes, but John Cooper seems very level-headed, and they run, their highs aren't too high, their lows aren't too low, and they just plod through. So, that's what makes great coaches, right? Sometimes it's the moves that you don't make that are most valuable to be a coach. What player you call in, what player do you snap on, who are you motivating today? But motivation shouldn't even be the factor, right? It should be just more about focus and control. And, with that being said, that same conversation has to happen in every locker room. In Toronto's locker room, game 2 is going to get harder. And as the series goes on, certainly against the Stanley Cup champions, that I think Toronto's in a great place, but their level is going to have to rise as well.
Yeah, and because of all the success they've had in the past, it's impossible to sit here and think Toronto has some raging advantage in the series. But one thing that stood out to myself and to Kipper too in our talk earlier is just the Leafs' speed. They looked like the faster team. They had the energy. Tampa either looked slow or not energized, one of those two things. I wonder if there's a way or a place that Tampa could get to in this series where they would say this Maroon, Perry, Belmar line is not quick enough to keep up. Like, would they ever make a roster change, or do you think they'll just stick with this lineup knowing what they've been through in the past, even if Toronto continues to outskate them the way they did in Game 1?
I can tell you this. It's a great question. If Tampa's even considering, changing lineups after that game. Now, listen, there's always players in waiting, ready for their opportunity, but you've built your team. They went through the whole season with those guys. they're not throwing them under the bus yet. I can promise you that. And they're not that slow, and they've been a pretty valuable line for a long time, or certainly the season in Tampa. So I wouldn't think that that's an issue. Obviously, if you get down 2 or 3 games, coaches become desperate, and maybe they have to make a big change. Maybe they play 7 defensemen. It all comes down to injuries too, right? I mean, there are going to be injuries in this series and players not playing at 100%. So those things do happen, but that was a great hockey game. Toronto played at home. If I'm in that locker room in Tampa, Nick, you've been there. You're saying, listen, let's win game 2. If you're Tampa, let's win game 2, get a split on the road, and home ice advantage is now, nullified, or it's in our favor. So that's what they're saying in Tampa. But the bottom line is you got to, put your money where your mouth is, and you got to go out and perform. And I'd expect a barn burner in game 2, but we'll soon find out.